Okay, thank you for the introduction, Marina. This is the fourth, as Marina said, in our series of talks about the Mahatmas, about the masters and their wisdom, we have titled it. Tonight, I'm going to talk about our relationship to the masters. And so perhaps I need to kind of clarify the language of that just at the outset. Very often we talk about our relationship, and when it comes to speaking in terms of the Mahatmas, obviously we're not going to be talking about some sort of a personal relationship. So this isn't going to be a how-to discussion about how to better our relationship skills in any sense that we might think of as personal. I do have to say, after we talked last week, and last week we went into something about the Mahatma Letters, we had a very spirited discussion after the webcast ended, around the refreshment table, and really caused me to think about this idea of the Mahatmas. Not so much to call into question any of the things that I've said, so I'm not going to do any sort of retraction today, so don't worry about that. But really to kind of think through what it means for us to talk about this whole idea of the Mahatmas. In the conversation that we were having last week after the talk, one of the things came up was that this whole idea of the masters or the Mahatmas can be something that's a little bit difficult sometimes to swallow. I mean, just in the talks that we've had here, we've talked a little bit about how the Mahatma Letters came to be produced. This whole idea that many of these letters were actually precipitated, which is to say kind of just fell from nothing and then came into being, full-formed. We talked about some of the ways that people had encountered the Mahatmas, either in their physical bodies or sometimes in very, very unusual, phenomenal sorts of circumstances. And in many ways, the sort of notoriety that was received during Blavatsky's time and during the time that all of these letters were being received from the Mahatmas, it was something that got a lot of notoriety. I mean, it was something that made it into newspapers of the time. People were arguing the points. People were discussing it. Thunder. I tell you, when you talk about the Mahatmas, things start to happen. So this will be no exception tonight. So for those of you who might have doubted, has this changed anything for you? But no, just to say that it was something that received an awful lot of notoriety. And people fell down on all sorts of different sides of this issue. Many people felt it was the biggest hoax ever perpetrated. This whole idea of Mahatmas and letters and people precipitating things. For the people who were actually there and experienced it, for the people who saw these letters materialize, and there were many, and the people who reported about it, it was something that was an undeniable fact. It's like me trying to deny that I'm looking at you and I see you dressed in brown, and somebody who hasn't seen you completely doubts it. How do you argue that? So, that was a sort of a condition that was going on. I think of it very much, the only contemporary example that I can think of would be something like the UFO sightings. Where countless people of all different sorts of walks and stations in life saw something that they described. And they saw it on a variety of different levels. Some people encountered it in various different ways. But that it was something that was undeniable for those that witnessed it, But for the rest, it's just, the latest front page in the Inquirer. And, they like to make things up. So, that was a sort of a condition that we have with this whole issue of the masters. And that in and of itself is that causes no difficulty, except when you get to the point that so much of what we think of as the foundational teachings of Theosophy derived from that source, at least of contemporary Theosophy. So it's one of those things where the masters and the validity of what the masters have to say, it's something that we probably would be best served if we were to just let it stand on the actual teachings that came from this reported source. So it's something that's been a feature of anyone who tries to approach the study of modern-day Theosophy, that somewhere along the way you come into this whole realm of Mahatmas, masters, and then you have to kind of make up your mind how you're going to deal with that, how you're going to relate to this as an idea first, and then perhaps if there's some sort of validity to the idea itself, then you can maybe think in terms of how to go beyond that. In what sense any sort of relationship with or to the masters might be meaningful. But I think for most people it begins relating to the idea of the masters. Getting either into or getting past or just feeling that you just can't deal with this idea of these enlightened beings whose knowledge is extensive, far beyond ours, whose development is such that things we regard as sort of phenomenal occurrences are just sort of normal activity for them, and who are able to speak in terms of in-depth description of the constitution of the human being and the universe in which we reside. So I think for those to whom the Mahatmas have some sort of deep significance, then those are people who tend to have, one way or another, become comfortable with the idea that this is in fact a reality. For those who do not feel that there's some sort of validity to the idea or to the history behind this idea, then it's probably best just to stick with the teachings themselves, because they can speak for themselves. But what I'm going to talk about more so a little bit tonight is it only is something that's meaningful to someone who might feel that there is something to relate to, that there are in fact masters, Mahatmas, that are in some way deeply concerned and involved in the development of humanity and able to work with those who are of a mind to cooperate and to try and understand more deeply what their plan is and what their work is. So one way to say it might be that in terms of our particular spiritual path and our approach to unfolding, that really the masters, the Mahatmas, are, and this is almost on the verge of sacrilegious, it's hard for it to even come to my lips. The Mahatmas are irrelevant. That you can proceed, you can become as deeply involved as your constitution permits without ever having to touch or deal with the idea of the Mahatmas. So it's irrelevant. But it's only irrelevant until that point where it becomes relevant to you. And at that point, it marks a marked shift in the way in which you approach your own unfoldment and your relationship really to others as well. So what it is that brings about this sort of shift in point of view is the key element, really. Because it's something that we can study about the Mahatmas deeply. You know, there's many works that are written about them, many sort of interpretations of their teachings and of the meaning of their teachings. Those things we can study. And we can convince ourselves that there's some reality to that. And that's good. But really, that's something that's taking place at the level of our normal sort of analytical mind. So in just the same way that we can convince ourselves that, you know, if we think about it long enough and people tell us long enough, we can convince ourselves that red is yellow. We can do that sort of thing with our minds. It's very flexible at that level. And also very changeable at that level. So it's always sort of subject to the latest, most convincing argument. And that's the way that our minds tend to go. So at that level, there's a certain sort of solidity that starts to develop, but we're never really completely solid at the level of just our normal analysis. Because some new fact can come and change it. That's just the way it works. So what is it then that might be said to bring the Mahatmas into relevance in a person's life and approach? And really it involves a deeper perception than anything that we can see with just our normal sort of minds and eyes. We would be talking then about something of the nature of the intuition, of the buddhi, of the higher nature of each and every one of us. So really the appreciation for and sense of relevance of the masters is really the result of what we might describe as an intuitive moment or an intuitive perception, where somehow or another, either through the facts of karma that we have kind of developed along a certain way that we're able to see, or for some particular moment, something breaks through where the mind releases its hold on us momentarily and we see something differently, perhaps clearly. When that occurs, that's when this whole approach to, an idea of relationship to and with the Mahatmas takes on a new meaning. Now, I should say that one of the other problems that our minds encounter, just to give you an example of how that can work with this whole idea of the Mahatmas. Very often, I think before we talked about how there are many names that are used for the Mahatmas. Mahatmas, masters, rishis, adepts. And for the grouping, the organized sort of grouping of masters. They're spoken of as the hierarchy or the brotherhood. And it's even been described, because of their sense of purity, often we associate the color white with purity. So it's been described as the Great White Brotherhood. Just to tell you a story, I can remember a very, very good friend, and actually he's the person who is responsible for me becoming a member of the Theosophical Society. I guess indirectly, because he introduced the person who introduced me to the society. So his particular history was, his name was Sandy Mack, deeply, deeply spiritual man, theosophist. But an interesting feature of his history was that his father was born in the 1860s. Sandy Mack died a few years ago, and he was over 100 then. And his father had been a slave at the time of his birth. So he was freed, sometime when he was a very, very young man. So anyway, Sandy Mac's father was a slave. So he came from Selma, Alabama, that whole area. And he's up here in Chicago, and he's joined the Theosophical Society. And I never will forget, because he laughed about himself about this thing for years. And he was in this very room. It was arranged differently, of course. He was in this room listening to a lecture, and he said the lecture was just wonderful. And it was so uplifting, and he was right there with it. And it was all about the masters. And then he said it got to the point where the person was describing, you know, the work of the masters and how they work together. He said, yes, and the Great White Brotherhood. And he said when he heard this black man from down south, he heard Great White Brotherhood, it's just like the blinders came over his eyes. He said, oh no, not this again. And he said, so he got up and walked out. He laughed about himself for that sort of moment of blindness about some words for years to come. But, you know, I just mentioned that to say that this idea and the way we try to express this idea necessarily comes with certain sort of baggage that can excite or it can turn somebody off completely. So a person finds himself at this point where, for whatever reason, they have had this kind of intuitive experience where they realize that there is, in fact, some sort of progression in consciousness that occurs, and that standing ahead of us in terms of this progression and unfoldment of consciousness, there are these beings that are described as the Mahatmas, the masters. And how is it then that I can find a way to more deeply understand this process that kind of leads to this pinnacle of human development? I have known a few people during the course of my time in the spiritual practice and development who have been very deeply devoted to the Mahatmas, to the masters. I have known a couple of people who would even say that they have seen the Mahatmas, but always it has been in a dream or in a vision. I can't say I've met anyone who has told me, you know, I saw the physical body, you know, standing here and we had a conversation. But I know people who have a deep reverence for and devotion to the Mahatmas. And there are people who are as sane as, I was starting to say you and me, but at least as sane as you. And they're very, very convinced, and their lives sort of show something very different. So what is it that the life shows? In the book that we're going to be going over in our next Living Theosophy classes, webcasts, it's going to be At the Feet of the Master, which, you know, for those who are familiar with it, it's just a very, very short book, and it only talks about 4 things. So we're going to have 4 nights to talk about each one. But it's all focused on how it is that one who finds some sense of value in this idea of the Mahatmas can cultivate themselves to be of greater use or of greater connection to the masters. And so the title, you know, At the Feet of the Master. But not to go into that, only to say that there is one particular passage in there that talks about, what it says is, if you have seen the Master, you will trust him to the uttermost through many births and through many deaths. It's a paraphrase. I think I got it. I think I got it right, for the most part at least. So, if you have seen the Master, and you know, when I think about that, it's one of those things that, again, you have to kind of ask yourself, knowing as I do, many, many theosophists, many, many people in the spiritual world who would tell you that they've seen the Master. None of them have laid eyes on him that I know. So it has to make me think that when you're talking about that, that there's something more to it than just, visual contact. That the sort of sight we're speaking of is something much deeper than just the eyes that can be easily blinded. So, to see the Master, obviously, to me at least, would tend to be speaking about this intuitive perception of who and what the Master is. And what that brings about, in the words of this particular quote from At the Feet of the Master, is a deep and unshakable trust. Trust to the uttermost. And it goes on to say that where there is no trust, there cannot be the perfect flow of love and wisdom, but there cannot be the perfect flow of love. So, just in normal sorts of thinking, anybody who has been involved with any sort of relationship, whether it be husband and wife, child and parent, even friend, you find that there's one thing that is completely required for any sort of non-dysfunctional relationship. And the one element that's required is trust. Violate that once, and it's something that can completely damage any sort of relationship among us as just human beings. But where that sort of trust exists, all of us have found that it creates some sort of openness. That somehow or another, when we can trust another, then what it is that is within that person, and we're only talking about people, not normal people like you and me, whatever it is that's within that person, the walls that might block that are absent. And so as a result, we find ourselves becoming much more deeply aware of, much more deeply connected to that other person. There's a wonderful book by Clara Codd called Trust Yourself to Life. And it speaks about this same idea, but on a much broader sort of palette that she paints it on. And I think for most of us, the normal experience that we have just in becoming the people that we have become is at certain points in our development, we have found moments where we've had trust that has been broken. Whether often we're marked by the trust that we thought we could have for a parent even, and they just let us down. And so from that point on, for many of us, some sort of door closes. And we spend a lifetime trying to unlearn the sorts of incorrect learnings that we have developed over our life. And it becomes a barrier. It becomes a barrier to normal sorts of relationships. It becomes a barrier, certainly, to something deeper. These same ideas apply. And I say that because very often it is our tendency when we approach something related to the spiritual path to kind of think of it as something that is just so lofty and so elevated that it must necessarily be beyond my normal life experience, which I would say is a spiritual misunderstanding. That ties in with the idea that I'm presenting myself to develop. I'm going to be open to this spiritual path, and I'm ready for anything that comes. May I be tested. And so we wait for the time that comes when we're going to have to, jump in front of a speeding truck that's just about to run the Dalai Lama over, and we can save him so that the world can be safe for peace. And this is when we're going to really show who it is that we are. Another foolish idea that we the big tests are what we're looking for. But really, the daily test, the daily initiation that we go through is nothing like that. It's nothing at all. I mean, the ability that we have to step away from what's described in the Mahatma Letters as this strong self-personality in Buddhism, there's this whole idea of incorrect identification, that we call ourselves something that we're really not. And so we end up developing this self very deeply and clinging to it. So there's this whole idea of self-grasping, that we have thoughts, we have ideas, we have a personality that wants to perpetuate itself and will grasp at anything to do so. And so we find that bleeding into almost every situation in life. And we also find it being one of the main blockages we have to this moment that we feel we're ready to develop and we want to unfold. We see something higher that is a possibility. And yet all of these sorts of habits of mind that put us at the center of the universe, that have us feel that in some way we're in opposition to all others, are things that actually are impediments to any sort of relationship with the Mahatmas. And actually, you don't even have to think of it as the Mahatmas. If you just think of it as what is the thing that on the deepest level is the most healthy way for me to behave, then probably we would have a better idea of what it is that would develop a deepened relationship with the Mahatmas. And one of those things, just the natural development of trying to move beyond this self-centered attitude that most of us, all of us have, is to look beyond the self, to try and somehow engage in some of the other sufferings in the world, and to try and align ourselves in some sort of way to be a blessing to that. I started to say that, you heard the thunder, right? See, I have an advantage. I saw the flash of lightning outside, but I couldn't speak quick enough to say something that would make you think that I'm commanding the elements, I can remember, actually, I was talking to a group one time, and I didn't see the thunder. And I was saying something about, it was something, and I remember I said, and then at that moment, it happened. And I was pausing, and this terrific lightning struck, and people looked at me. If I had wanted to be a guru, that was my moment, and I just missed it. But in terms of what it is that makes us useful to others, what it is that makes us useful within our families, within our communities, those are sorts of basic things that also make us usable to what we might describe as a higher power, or to the Mahatmas. And that's sort of like an entry level. Obviously, in the Mahatma Letters, one of the things that's described is various sorts of levels of connection to the Mahatmas. Everything from someone who is just living a useful life to someone who has really committed themselves to actively deepening their spiritual life. They speak about the chelas of the masters, the ones who are actually the accepted students of the master, which is a very different level from anything that we function on. For the chela of the master, those are the ones who have really made a systematic sort of cultivation of their inner life, who have systematically dropped off these kind of encumbrances that we all carry around with us. In the, one of the things that H.P. Blavatsky wrote, which has become something of a mantra for many people, and it also describes this pathway of unfoldment and right thinking, you could say. And it's called the Golden Stairs. And it's really just a simple description of qualities that would in fact make us deepen our relationship to the Mahatmas. And it's something like a clean life is the first thing that's said. So, very clearly, certain habits don't help us and certainly block us from others. If we're going to behave in such ways where we weaken our body, where we weaken our emotions through appetites that we have that we don't have control over, it has a polluting effect. And it makes it very difficult, it makes it difficult for us to communicate with one another, let alone with something or someone who is of a much finer sort of vibratory rate. So a clean life, an open mind, a pure heart, all of these things talk about qualities. An unveiled spiritual perception. It's yet another thing, taking the veil off. And it's taken off by means of these same sorts of openness of mind, cleanliness of life, purity of heart. A brotherliness for one's co-disciple. So once you feel that you actually have committed to a path, then immediately what happens is you start to find people of a like mind being drawn toward you, and you being drawn toward them. And then the attitude is just treating them as if you're really fingers on the same hand. A brotherliness, like it's a family sort of relationship. And so that's something that is spoken of as very important as well. Very often within the Theosophical Society, you find that, you seem to meet people very often that somehow you feel as if you have known. I mean, you hear that all the time, where people be thinking about things, talking about things together, and they feel as if this isn't the first time, that we've known each other somehow or somewhere, that there's a sort of shared bond around this one central idea. So, that's an example of this kind of brotherliness. And then it goes on to say a number of other things, but I would just advise that you take time just to look those up, see what it says. There are a number of guides and helps that we can kind of read. Among those are the At the Feet of the Master, and the qualities of discrimination, desirelessness, and the others that are mentioned. But probably at the most fundamental level, if the idea of the Mahatmas is something that is in fact has reality, then what they would say is that really the seed of this Mahatma is within each and every one of us. That it's not something that we have to search for. It's not something that we have to make a pilgrimage anywhere outside of ourselves to encounter. That the Mahatma is really completely available at every moment within us. So the higher self is really. H.P. Blavatsky said that there were two voices that she would listen to and obey invariably. To her, she said these two voices were voices that were infallible. And the first voice was the voice of her master. The second voice was the voice of what she described as her inner master, which is to say her own higher self. And that when that voice would speak, when she was in a frame of mind where she was able to actually hear that voice speaking within her, it would be something that is infallible. So for us, who have not had the experience perhaps of meeting this other master, the higher self is something that's always available. And probably it would be something that we would be well served to try and cultivate that, to try and follow these very simple steps that will unfold our ability to hear, our ability to see this intuitive insight. So I think that's about all that really I have to say on that for this evening. Maybe we could have such questions as there might be.
Tim, you said this inner self Blavatsky talks about, and I wondered if it was in The Voice of the Silence, because I think it was, you know, The Voice of the Silence, one of the opening parts of it, I recall it said, you know, it's the silence after the thunder, and the silence after the thunder, and then maybe that's, you know, where the wisdom is, the silence after that thunder. And I just wondered if you could talk about the voice of the silence a little. I don't mean to put you on the spot, or this inner self that Blavatsky talks about.
Sure. Probably a lot of what might be regarded as the thunder, first of all, is the noise that fills our normal daily life and our normal consciousness. For most of us, it is the equivalent of a thundering sound that seems to constantly be with us. That at whatever moment that subsides, it's only then really that we're able to sense this other voice. I have thought of it sometimes as if, for example, if we're at a big room, you know, I don't know, a cocktail party, in theosophical terms, everybody'd be drinking apple juice, but, you know, everybody's chatting and clinking glasses, and the music is on, and we're all talking to one another. And if we were to suppose, perhaps, that there is some very, very wise woman who's whispering something over in the corner, as we all go about our business of chatting and comparing news and pouring cocktails, we'd be completely unable to hear that voice. But if for some reason the room suddenly went quiet, you might be able to hear a little bit of that. But because she's whispering, no one would really benefit from the wisdom. So the process, I mean, just an example to talk about what the process might be. In terms of like a spiritual practice, the process for us is really something of trying to move ourselves closer to that still small voice. And that as we're able to put ourselves in its proximity with a listening ear, we will hear something. We will sense something. And then what that does, the party doesn't stop. After we've heard, then we're able to go back out into that party, and then you can communicate something. And then once we know how to do that, how to go back and forth, then we're functioning in this world. You know, we're going from the voice of the silent, the voice of wisdom, and then we're still functioning in the world as well. So I mean, that's just an example. But the quiet that occurs when our thoughts, our thundering thoughts cease, enables us to hear.
Well, I've wondered as you were speaking tonight about how much, you know, when you go in a direction, it kind of creates, things just open up and unfold. And I wonder how much what we bring to it, our intention with it, actually creates what we find. I mean, do we see the masters because we're looking for them? Are they really there?
We do have a strong ability to hypnotize ourselves with a lot of this. But one of the real answer is when you're not going to be able to figure it out kind of analytically. It's like somebody saying, am I really in love? And most people who ask that question, the answer is no. Most of us. Because we're having to think about it, we weigh it out. And most of the time, we probably don't even know what love is. But there is a certain quality of love that is unquestionable. And I think in the same way, this whole approach to the masters is one where until we have actually learned how to see clearly, it stays in the realm of an idea. But then once we actually do perceive, I think the words in At the Feet of the Master are correct. You know, once we have seen, then the trust is to the uttermost. And that's the difference. The difference between seeing with the eye and seeing with the inner eye.
Any questions or comments for Tim?
Last chance, Chris.
At the beginning of the talk, you said that this idea of the masters is kind of difficult to swallow. And, similar ideas are in other traditions. And for some reason, they are accepted. When the Tibetan Buddhists, they say Padmasambhava gave these teachings to a lama, and Padmasambhava had died, 400 years before.
Sure.
But anyway, the Theosophical Society, was from the beginning very blunt in many things, in the sense that many of the ideas that the TS put forward were clashing the general view from a scientific point of view, from a philosophical point of view, or religious. Many of those ideas were later, corroborated. Many of those are still to be corroborated or not. But anyway, the attitude was, if we are honest and we think that this is true, we are not going to say whatever people want to listen, to hear. Because today, many gurus, organizations, they say what they know people want to hear, so that more people will come and hear. So I think, of course, we have to be aware of how, what people need, what can be good for the spiritual upliftment of humanity. But I think it's okay. Yeah, there are many ideas that are not easy to accept, and it doesn't really matter from my point of view.
Mm-hmm. I think one of the beauties of the Theosophical Society is it doesn't require acceptance of it. Just accept the idea that there is, in fact, value in brotherhood, in the oneness of life. And then, then we're all allowed to kind of pick and choose. But certainly there's no question that the Mahatmas are very closely interwoven with everything within the Theosophical Society's history.
I have been listening to Speaking of Faith.org, and they had an interview with John Kabat-Zinn, and he said that Buddha left his wife and children to, and you were talking about clean life, pure heart. How do we apply that in our daily life without renunciation? Because Buddha renounced everything, left everything behind. But it's also, I'm not saying that that is a better way or that is a simple way, because you try that and it's not as easy as we thought. It's not going to be as simple as that. But just in our daily lives, just going on the purity of heart and this loving kindness. How do we go on without renouncing, renunciation? So that's in your point of view.
Yeah.
So.
Actually, it seems if really all of those things are really qualities that are already within us. I mean, oftentimes we think as if it's something we have to get, that we don't have. But the seeds of all of those things seem to be within us, and it seems to really be the normal sort of, the normal way that people express when they're not so deeply imprinted by the society as we have become. It seems if it's not something where you so much have to renounce as it is that you have to recognize and accept those qualities that are within you. Because obviously, I mean, for a person who is brutal to animals or something like that, it's not where they have to renounce beating the animal. Rather, that they can acknowledge that this is something that causes suffering to this animal, that probably the animal's not too much different from us, that it's not looking to suffer. You know, those sorts of basic ideas, that if you think them through, there's a certain logic that demands action. So, you know, a clean life, anyone who has gone on a junk food diet knows that you don't feel good. You know, it doesn't take too long. And so it's not a matter of renouncing junk food. It's just a matter of eating things that promote your health. Same thing with our thoughts. You know, to the extent that we find ourselves mired in thoughts of jealousy and hatred and comparison and all the sorts of things we tend to do, you don't feel good. So, I mean, the simplest thing to do really is, if you're aware, any one of us, we can see what it is that makes us feel good. And generally, that's also one of these qualities that can kind of fall into the category of a clean life. Purity of heart. To the extent that we harbor animosities, you know, you can, the person you have something against is going home and they're sleeping very, very well that night. And you're up late at night. So, I mean, these are very simple things that they're talking about. And so, I mean, to that extent, I don't think it requires renunciation. Buddha was something very different, because his was a determination to actually be free from this, being caught on this cycle of birth, rebirth, death, sickness, old age. And so he was determined he was going to break that cycle. And in order to do that, that's a very different level of function. Yeah. Yes.
I'm not sure how to articulate this question, but it had something to do with, you know, trying to live a clean life and come from a pure heart, and how that feels good, ultimately. Getting in touch with ourselves enough to know what feels good, really, truly, and then to keep going in that direction, which seems to me to employ some discipline. But then what is the whole point? I mean, I've heard about these vibratory rates. You mentioned that term earlier. Can you speak to that?
Well, I mean, I think you find results on a number of different levels. A lot of people that I know, I mean, very often you can find that you change something in your physical behavior, and then next thing you know, you find that it affects your kind of emotional nature and the thoughts that you think. With this, everything about us is interconnected, first of all. So what might begin as something that's just a health regimen can progress to deeper levels. For example, vegetarianism. It's something that many people adopt because they feel as if it's something that's going to promote a better state of health. You know, people study about it and they see that you live longer, perhaps, you have less heart disease, cancer, all that. So it's good for your health. And that might be where it begins. But then people who start that way tend to find that they start to actually feel different in other ways. And perhaps their perception changes about not just how well we feel, but perhaps, you know, the involvement in the suffering of other beings becomes important. So it's not just about me feeling good, it's about the fact that I have to develop a lifestyle that does less harm to others, animals in particular. And so what began as what I put in my mouth as food now goes to a whole lifestyle that embraces something much broader than just me. The whole definition of spirituality, and which is one of those words that we bandy about very easily, spirituality always speaks of a broadening awareness of a sense of oneness, of a deeper sort of connection with all things. So anything that moves us in that sort of direction is of a spiritual nature. And, you know, the point of it, I mean, if you could say there is a point, the point, I guess, is to ultimately have a sense that there is no separation, that, you know, all other beings and me are part of this one process. We all are engaged in this. And that's a state of consciousness. So I think once we get to that point, we start to see things a little bit differently. It's no longer just about what's in it for me, which is what we all talk about. In fact, there was a great Catholic teacher who spent a lot of time, I think, in India as well, Anthony de Mello. De Mello, yeah. Wonderful. But what he talked about was that, from his point of view, anything that anyone did was really about what was in it for them. So he said, whether you're a saint, you know, whether it's Mother Teresa, she's doing good works because it's something that really, it feeds her, it makes her feel good, which is an interesting idea. Whether it's true at all levels, I don't know, but for most of us, I think it is.